Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Penny Lee is one of the very few people with the front row seat to a presidential election campaign, the Clintons' humble intelligence and the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008. Her journey spans both sides of the public and private sector equation. Having extracted herself from politics, she's now president and CEO of the Financial Technology Association in the US. You're in for a treat on Pivot Points this week. Go behind the scenes of American politics and discover the most powerful word in leadership, the cultural shock between public and private sector life, and the invaluable advice she gives to fellow female leaders. I'm really excited today to have Penny Lee on the podcast. And Penny, why don't you just introduce yourselves? You had an amazing career, very varied. Just give yourself a little bit of an introduction, if you don't mind.
Well, Dave, it's great to be with you and good to see you again. As you said, my career has not necessarily always followed a straight line, but tried to make a consistency throughout. And I would say, where I am now, I'm president and CEO of the Financial Technology Association, which in the US is what they would call a trade association. So we represent the entire we represent a large part of the fintech industry. We're on the non-crypto side, so a lot of my members are apps and products that you probably use on a daily basis, products such like PayPal, Klarna, Revolut, Chime, Block, Stripe. I always joke that a lot of our members, I'm in the one syllable kind of bandwidth for all my members with Brex, Ramp, Chime, all of them in the one syllable. But really, they are at the forefront of changing how we interact with financial services and this whole notion of tap to pay and the ability to be able to use banking wherever you are with your phone. That's who my members are, and that's who I represent in Washington. Do a lot of their advocacy and promotion of the industry. But, going backwards, I would say kind of the hallmark or kind of the thread of throughout my career and where I've tried to make the decisions and what I chose to some of it was chosen for me and some of it was, because of the opportunity was just always, my father was a minister and he always kind of instilled that, there's opportunities to be able to effectuate change, whether that's through a message, a sermon, a touch point with a person, or in my work, policy, how we could think through, by electing somebody or working on a certain policy or advocating for a certain industry. What is that change that we can effectuate based on the work we're doing?
And did that give you a sort of like a strong belief system? Because, I've known you a few years and you are a person of strong beliefs. Did that come from that?
It did. And I think, my father, he sometimes had to take some strong positions as to kind of where he felt either the doctrine was leading him or where he felt that, he should be ministering to a certain population or to his congregation. And so, some of it was unpopular. And what I learned in watching and observing him was, it no matter what you do, be convicted in what you are, but what your belief is, and stand firm for it. And people will appreciate, and I've learned this through politics as well, people will appreciate a strong point of view as long as it's consistent. If you are, someone with a finger in the wind and changing just because the polls might change or because, the electoral might change, people have a tend to kind of pull back from that, but they will respect you if you're consistent, if you're convicted, and if you are able to hear and have a balanced approach to it instead of so dogmated that you can't hear anybody else.
And is that sort of, you went into politics or got interested in politics at a very early age, I think like 16 or such.
Yeah.
So how did that happen? Because
I
think I could have been interested in politics at 16.
It was interesting. And it was actually at 14, it was a woman that was in my father's church and she was running for lieutenant governor. I grew up in Alaska. She was running for lieutenant governor of Alaska. She was a really wonderful person, and she was very exciting to be around, and she had, a real passion for wanting to lead the state. And so, it kind of fell into it. It was like, well, can I help? Is there anything I could do? She's like, well, can you answer phones? Can you, you know, help us, stuff in mailers? Can you, walk around the neighborhood and pass out my flyer? And so from that very early age, I saw how people responded to somebody with a message, somebody who had a vision, somebody who wanted to do something different in a state. And that kind of was an addiction that has now gone through many, many years and started my career on that, was just seeing that kind of response. And there were some doors that got slammed in your face, but yet, there was also those that the next one that was like, it's like, well, can I convince the next person to be able to listen to me? And so that kind of started the journey.
Yeah. I mean, did you find those people became your mentors? What were your takeaways from working? Because some of the people you worked with achieved, Harry Reid. I mean, he's a bit of a legend. So,
it's funny now in looking back on all the different politicians that I worked for and been around and been in the same room and just observed and watched and also been on the campaign. So, I had the privilege of working on the 2000 presidential campaign. So observed and saw up close, Al Gore, traveled a lot with Bill Clinton, Tipper Gore, Mrs. Clinton, a whole range of folks. So you got to see everybody in various different moments of stress, moments of clarity, moments of advocacy, all different realms. And when you're on a presidential campaign, nothing is normal.
I bet.
Everything is absolutely chaotic. Everything is incredibly messy. You're making split-second decisions, and it's just the volume of information and work that you have to do, digest, and make a decision about is incredible amount on a daily basis. And so you get to see people in all different kinds of realms. And then, worked for Governor Rendell of Pennsylvania, worked for then Harry Reid in the Senate. Everybody had their own kind of take and personality. And I would say with Harry Reid, that he was probably the one that I learned the most from, as far as kind of he and I related in that we're both more of an introvert than an extrovert. And he told me very, very early on, he said, I don't need anybody else to love me. I have my wife, I have my kids, I go home every night and I'm fine. And because of that security in who he was and not necessarily needing a plethora of friends or more people to adore him, he was able to say no to a lot of people, and he was able to make really hard decisions. But he did it with compassion, with empathy, and he did it in a way that people understood, like his word was golden. When he said, no, I can't do this for you today, but I will work on it in the next session, or I'll work on it in the next year, it was good. I mean, he would work on it in the next session. And so that power and that ability to be strong and to say no to people when everybody else wants to be, make sure they don't offend everybody, or they don't want to harm anybody, or they don't want to like ruffle any feathers, was really a lesson, especially in my role now as president of an organization, to kind of know you have that fortitude, that a strong no is sometimes as welcomed as a multiple yeses.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's a great learning that. And, I've often thought no is one of the most powerful words in leadership, because people understand precisely where they stand. They might not like it. They might not agree with you.
Yeah.
But learning that young and getting to understand, the power of no, closely followed in my mind by the power of silence, where you really make people think, is just a brilliant sort of learning. And it's interesting that you sort of put that to the fact that he was secure in his own family environment, that he didn't want people to just like him. Because, I'm sure lots of leaders make that mistake of wanting to be liked as opposed to respected.
Right.
And, the people you've parted, that you've worked with, they build phenomenal respect. And, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on, some of those people and how you think they've built respect in their worlds.
Yeah, for President Clinton, it was his intellect and also his compassion to, people respected the fact that he was likely the smartest person in the room whenever he was in the room. He and Mrs. Clinton, I would say, were both two of the smartest people I was ever around. And they took time and they thought and they cared and they, tried to be as well versed on any subject matter. So you knew when you were in that room they had a perspective that was broader, that was wider than we individually brought together. And collectively, he always tried to think, how is this going to better the US? How is this better to, effectuate the person that owns the diner in Arkansas? And so it was always in that lens that he was always trying to think through how is this policy going to affect everyday Americans and also maybe, the US global standing. So that was, he brought that power from that side as well, along with being incredibly personable. And, I was oftentimes the first person to, when we were going into dinners and things to, kind of be there, be the lead staff on certain events. And he was notoriously always late, always taking one more moment to have one more conversation or one more, handshake or, always wanted to make sure it was always what, so he was always late. So I was infamous for being the person that would always say, "The president is on his way. He is on with a world leader." We just, so I think they all got tired of me hearing about who the world leader might have been when in fact, he was just tied up in the Oval with another signature needed or one more phone call
Yeah.
needed to be made. And so it was always fun to be with them. And, and then but all of them had a consistency and had time to be around President Obama as well. And it's that inner strength and that force of personality that drives that change. Because I've seen others, senators, congressmen that just kind of are doing the job and checking the boxes and they are measuring their success and process, which is I called on the president, I drafted a bill, I wrote a speech, I delivered a speech. Everything is based off in process. Where these were on out, these individuals' success was on outcomes. What did I do to actually make that change happen? What did I do to get that bill done? How did I get, affordable healthcare in the United States? How did I force that to happen? And so I think that's the demarcation between those that are leaders and I mean especially on the executive side and risen to the top
Wow.
highest level is
Mm.
they're using that inner fortitude and strength and personality to actually make that change happen versus taking delight in the process.
Did you think you wanted to stay in that world forever? Because you obviously changed. Why did you change?
Yeah, it's I would say the campaign life is one for the young. And so after a couple of presidentials and other campaigns, it was time for me to come off the trail because it is your life. Because we used to joke, it's 25/8. You don't have a day off. And we had the privilege of working together on a project in DC and it was kind of in a little bit of a run in a little bit of a campaign mode. And
Mm.
it's all encompassing, it's all involved. You put everything, especially on a presidential for 18 months, that is your life. You put anything else on the side, and this is you are to build and sell basically a 6 to 8, $8 billion company in 18 months. And so that just everything else is just isolated for that. So after several of them, it was just time for me to kind of pull back and let others have
Yeah.
that great opportunity and kind of do some things that were probably more self-serving for myself and for me to be able to lead organizations.
So what did you do next? I mean, because that must have been like the biggest adrenaline rush for a fair few years, and suddenly you
Yeah,
go into something else. What did that feel
right.
like?
So it was yeah, it was 2008. So it was everything was coming together. I was working for Harry Reid. I was his senior advisor, and we were obviously it was during the presidential. Obama was running for president. We had four members of the Senate actually running for president at the time. So we were neutral during the primaries because we had, four different Democratic senators running at the time: Joe Biden, Chris Dodd, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama. So we were just observing. And then once it became evident, or, then Senator Obama was going to get the nomination, those of us that had political work were asked to kind of go and take a leave of absence and go on the campaign. So I was sent to Pennsylvania in August of '08 to kind of help, make sure deliver Pennsylvania for the campaign. And about a week in, I get a call from the senator saying, "I need you back in Washington." As we now know from history, mid-August, we were starting to see some of the economic news starting to
Yeah.
kind of percolate, and there was obviously signs of trouble within the economy. So all of us were kind of called back into Washington to
Wow.
start to dissect what this was happening. And then we had obviously the financial crisis, and where all of us was all hands on deck as we worked on that, as it then became evident. And I'll never forget being in the room when then Secretary of the Treasury Paulson came in and was like, and said to all of us, the Lehman Brothers, tonight will not exist tomorrow. And all of us were just like, okay. So
Impossible.
yeah, buckle up. What do we do now? So,
Yeah.
it was the financial crisis, it was the presidential election, it was, historic presidential election that it was, all of '08 all coming together, and then having to make the decision in January of 2009. The senator asked me if I wanted to stay another 2 years. It was kind of, you either had made the decision you were staying another 2 years, or you had to leave, to make sure
Yeah.
that he had the team he needed to do his own reelection. And so I just made the decision. I said to him, I was like, I can't guarantee you, if there's not an opportunity that doesn't come up in either the private sector or in the Obama administration, that I wouldn't entertain it. And with that, I need to resign, because you need someone 100% devoted to this task and to your own reelection and to running the Senate. So I said I should resign then at this point, because I can't guarantee that I wouldn't entertain something. So he understood it, he respected it, and we did a 6 weeks transition, which was very, very long for him. Usually, when someone resigns with him, he wants you gone the next day because you no longer want to work for him. But we had a lot of respect for one
Mhm.
another and worked through to make sure that he had the right team in place for him to be able to be successful. So the choices were out there on what do I do, and I had different offers to going in house to corporations. And I remember one of them, I walked into the office and it was very quiet and everybody was very, still. And I was like, oh, there's no way I can come off the adrenaline rush that I just did and be in a very, very calming, very staid. So I worked for a client with multi-client firm. So it was like felt like there was enough issues hitting you on a daily basis that you felt like you had at least a simulation of kind of the adrenaline that you had on Capitol Hill, but not, obviously not quite. You don't have the historical moments. You're not in the
Mm.
rooms where things are being changing, world and market impact. So
And when you were making a big sort of like pivotal decision in your life like that, did you talk to other people about it, or did you just in your own mind work out, I'm going to stop? And did you know what you were going to do next even?
I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. So I did talk to friends, kind of what atmospheres was like, others that had made this similar transition. What did they like about certain things and what they didn't. So I tried to do research, and I tried to kind of think through and knowing what I would want to do. And I would say it was one time where I was a lot more thoughtful in what I wanted. What was the atmosphere I needed? What was the surrounding that I support that I needed, or what kind of job would motivate me? Because, when you're a woman, when I was a woman coming through, it was like you were so grateful for any job, anybody that wanted to hire you. And so you
Mm.
often took like whatever job came down the pike, even if it wasn't necessarily the right fit. You didn't know enough to be selfish and to think back and step like, well, wait a second. No, 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 I want this. It just, in that day and time, there were so few opportunities for women that you felt like grateful, like, oh my gosh, somebody wants to hire me. I'll take the job. which not necessarily wasn't always necessarily the right fit. So, given where I was in my place and having had some of the success that I had had, I did when I made this change in '08, in '09, sorry, was I did take a pause and I was like,
Yeah.
what is it that I need actually, instead of let me just run to whoever wants to hire me. And so I found, I found a firm. It was a smaller firm. It wasn't a large firm, had multi clients, had multiple different interests. It had was able to use political skill and communication skill. I was in a role of leadership and president, so I was able to manage a team. So kind of recreated a little bit in the private sector of what I was doing in the public sector.
Mm. And what would you sum up as the difference between the public and the private sector? Because I've never had the privilege of talking to anybody who's done both and
I
made that
always
pivot.
yeah, I always say that to people that, kind of make that transition is you have to change your mindset in that when you're in government, you're a buyer. Everybody's coming to you. Everybody's giving you information. You have the whole world at your fingertips and that you can command meetings, oversight, you can investigations, you can do a whole bunch of different things and everybody's giving you kind of what they want you to hear or what they want you to pass or what they want you to do. So everything you're a buyer. And then on the other side, when you leave, you're a seller. You have to really kind of get in that different mindset of going from buyer to seller. And some
Mm.
people like it and some people don't. But it's just, I remember interviewing somebody that was leaving the Hill about a job, and I was like, how are you picturing? He's like, well, I still have access and everybody always tells me everything. I was like, not when you're in the private sector and you no longer have what they need to buy. So he's like, oh, and so later on he's told me, he's like, it is a different transition. And DC is famous for being pretty cutthroat on that. Even when I was leaving, Harry Reid's office, I'll never forget, you send out the I'm now leaving, more to come, blah blah blah. Kind of one of those mass emails. And I would say three-quarters of the email returns were, "Thanks. Do you know who your replacement is? And can you make an introduction?"
Yeah.
Not a lot of love. It's a
Yeah.
very transactional town.
Do they give you a leaving party?
Yeah, exactly. No.
You're gone. You're gone.
You're
You've
gone.
gone to the other
Next.
side.
Exactly. Next. Next.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I remember going from a very big company to a very small company when I was in my 20s. And the culture shock was just like massive. In my big company, people came and changed the light bulbs. In my small company, the managing director kept the light bulbs in his desk. What was the culture shock like going from those two worlds?
Yeah, I would say part of it wasn't probably as shocking because, like I said, on the campaigns, it's like you're running startups and you do everything, and your job is, you're not just in an isolated box. Although I was, one of the lead finance people, that didn't mean to say that, when the name tags weren't written correctly or the seat placements, or I'll never forget President Clinton had very bad allergies, and so it was always you either had to have the flowers really high or really low. And so I remember one time, because it was just I remember we were sitting there and I was off back, and the lead Secret Service guy goes, "You nailed the height of the flowers, Penny." I was like, "You're welcome." You're welcome. So there was no task too small when you're on these
Yeah, yeah.
campaigns. And
That
like I
detail.
said, you're raising billions and hundreds of millions of dollars, but yet you have to be adherent to all the various different details of these things. So, it wasn't, I don't think, as much of a cultural shock, although what you what you do appreciate is how much information you do have when you're in government, and that
Yeah,
ability to get a report written, to get the top research done, to be able to think very, very large on certain things and be able to actually move and change that on the private sector, you're moving needles, but in a very, very different way. Yes, there is some incredible work that the private sector does, and developing new drugs and new ways of autonomous vehicles and all of that innovation. And I work in a very innovative world right now, and so that is very,
Mm,
very exciting. It's just a little bit different as to kind of we're still adherent to the rules and regulations, and the government can any one day, change their mind or, change the rules and either put us out of business or be able to perpetuate even more innovation. So we're still adherent to kind of what the rules and regulations that the government is setting.
And I mean, I know you have a passion for fostering and helping women in business. Does that come from those early years where, it was interesting to hear you say, you'd take it any job that, which seems crazy to me.
Yeah. But it was, especially in politics, there was oftentimes the one job for a woman. And it was like everybody like clawed each other, like
All right.
elbowed everybody out for that one job kind of thing. And so when you were the one offered it, despite whether or not be a good fit, like you took that role. And
Yeah.
I would say even in Harry Reid's office, there was five of us or six of us in senior staff. I was the only woman still in seniors in that realm. And so there's still an inequity. And, I had started a angel investment group and with a large focus in 2013. It was a side hustle was did that I did with other friends. And it still is today. Even this was 2013. The funding levels for female founders was 98 to 2. 2% go to women founders and 98% go to non-female founders. And,
That's crazy.
just try and it's today, even 10, 12 years later, it's still that same ratio. And I'll never forget, I was on a panel and, I had somebody, a white male stand up and said, it's getting so hard to get funding now that there's so much emphasis on DEI and there's so much emphasis on, making sure underrepresented founders, it's just making it very, very hard for me to raise money. And I was like, it's 98 to 2 to 2. I was like, whenever it becomes 50-50 or reversed, then I might have sympathy for you, but it's 98 to 2. And so just knowing that inequity that is there, and I think, having diverse teams does bring better products and better quality and higher returns for individuals, and just giving that chance because we will selectively collect, we will collect or select everybody within our universe that we know. And so
Mm,
trying to like change and break kind of those barriers just from natural selection is something that, wanted to do. And so wanting to bring more women into the workforce, wanting to, promote women in positions in which they can also then kind of create their own ecosystem. Because if you don't break some of these barriers or just natural kind of networks of who it's going to just continue to be 98 to 2.
yeah. And what sort of things can you do to break that? Because again, great ideas come from anywhere. They ain't dependent on your gender.
No, they really aren't. And I would say it takes purpose. You have to be thoughtful and purposeful about it because, if you just send something out on LinkedIn saying, I have a job opening, please send in your resume, and you will see, you might get, a disproportionate from one side or the other, but to really take the time to think through. And you also have to kind of sometimes look at resumes a little bit differently. They might not have had quite the experience or the internships or all of those kind of things, but some of that is because lack of access or
Mm,
they weren't available, be able to fund a non-funded internship or those kind of things. So you kind of have to look to think through an interview and take the time to say, what else out of this resume can I pull or can I glean that this might be a good fit, and take a little bit of a risk or take more of a chance because they might not have the most sterling resume or CV that they look that comes across your desk,
mm.
but being thoughtful and purposeful is like, all right, let me see if this person can, I might push them into a role that they might not be comfortable, but I know they're capable of.
And I mean, if you were to sort of give advice to a 21, 25-year-old woman from your learnings, you're clearly a successful leader and a very successful woman. What sort of advice or what sort of things, you know, if you had your time again, would you do things differently? What sort of advice would you give to a budding 21-year-old superstar businesswoman?
I would say in the same way as, I try to be thoughtful and purposeful in like who I hire. In the same respect, think through why do you want a certain job? What is it about it? And if you can't necessarily articulate, what it is that you could contribute or how you think you could better improve or be part of that atmosphere, it's probably not the right fit for you. So
Mm.
I would say more so than I was in my early stage when I was just like, oh, grabbing whatever opportunity I could and will let the chips fall. And they, and it is, I've learned obviously from all my different experiences, but I think in a time when you can be a little bit more quote unquote choosy, make sure, take that time to think through, is this the right atmosphere for me? Does it feel like a team that will help me succeed? Will I, what skills do I need to perfect and learn? Kind of how can I be a better team player? And I will always say though, but please don't walk into an interview and say, I need the best work-life balance, because that will make my eyes shut down. I was like, wrong person. I don't have this. I still don't, I'm still working on my work-life balance, but be open, be willing, be excited, wanting to work there. Because you as someone who does a lot of hiring, you can just feel when someone's like just trying to check a box, or
Yeah.
they're not really committed, or they're like, I'm just doing this because I need a job. And you can just feel that. And it's like, I want to hire people that, while they might not love the subject matter, they don't might not understand the industry, they're at least committed and passionate about working
Mm.
and being part of a team to make kind of the whole all parts work together. And so just, once you've said, like gone into an interview, be committed to it.
Mm. And then when you sort of took on the role at the FTA, the Financial Technology Association, did you find becoming the CEO suddenly a revelation? Wow, people do what I ask them to do, and there's nobody else behind it. What
Well,
were your
it's
learnings
funny.
from becoming the leader?
It was a startup. And so, I was at Multi-Client and we were representing a lot of fintech companies and was recruited out of there by some GCs and others that were starting this new organization saying, we just don't have a collective voice for the fintech industry. It's growing, it's, under a lot of regulatory scrutiny, and we just need someone that can lead it. And would you be, they were interviewing multiple people, and one of the member companies asked if I'd be interested. And I knew like the multi-client derivative role was not for me for long term. And so I jumped at the chance again to lead and run an organization and be kind of have that ability to kind of think through how we want to build it, how we want to structure it, what team do you want to put in place. So I jumped at that chance. And I will say the one thing I did do was, because they were interviewing for executive director, and I said, I will only take it if the title's CEO, because I
Yeah.
knew that was important to set that marker. One, for it to have a seriousness, for the organization to have a seriousness, not treat it just like a nonprofit executive director. But I also knew for me in my career, it was important to have that title as well. So we worked through that, but that was one of the first things I did, was that this role needs to be CEO, not executive director. And then since then, I've been able to build it.
And have you found that all of the things you've learned through childhood, time in politics, time in business have all come together in one role now?
It does. It kind of like you have to you kind of take the composite, as I'm sure you do as well. And so you can harken back to days of struggle. And I'll never forget the one lesson I learned early on was on the campaign for Ann Richards, who was the second woman governor of Texas, a very, very colorful personality, a very, she had been an alcoholic for 20 years, sober, and now is kind of reformed and just had this really amazing wit and personality, and just strong, like white hair, with the,
Yeah.
all teased up. And she was an amazing character. And, after her campaign, we worked for her consultant. And then one day she was doing a press conference and we had a client that was interested in it. And for some reason, it was a press conference. And for some reason, I raised my hand and asked a question. I think I was so used to being around the team or whatever. I just, I was 24 and I just asked this question. Oh my gosh, all eyes were on me. By the time I walked back to the office, my boss said, "Did you just ask a question?" I mean, he's like, "You need to write a letter to the governor. You need to apologize. You need to tell her you're sorry. Like, if she asks for your resignation, you're gone. Do you understand? You just don't do those kind of things. Like, that was embarrassing. Like, you're going to ruin our whole reputation." I was like, "All right." So 3 days, I wrote her a note. 3 days later, before email, I get this letter to our office from the governor's office. I was like, oh, great. Here comes a resignation. On the letter that I had sent to her, my apology, on the letter, she said, "Penny, I've learned more from all of my mistakes than all of my successes." And so that compassion, kind of propelled me. And so I try to have that same when I know people in my office might have made a mistake. The grace that a governor gave me to keep my job is something that I still try to instill, and the grace that my father had for, folks at his church and for all others is just kind of pushing that envelope, but do it with balance and grace.
That's brilliant. I mean, it's a lovely thought to end the sort of the podcast on, and thank you for sort of participating. We always end with a little fun fact, and when I learned you were a 7 handicap golfer, I decided I'm definitely not going to talk about that. But that's some achievement. But I with my company called Bram Pie and your mum being a major pie winner, you have to tell me about that.
Oh, so my mother was an amazing cook and baker and things. And so she, in Alaska, they have the Alaska State Fair, which was in my hometown of Palmer. And she every year had, because she was known for just being this incredible baker. And obviously with my father, not obviously, but my father with the church, we always had people over every Sunday. And, she was always cooking multiple meals and potlucks and, all different kinds of things. And so people knew her. Well, she would be a judge. And one year she decided, you know what? I'm going to make this one kind of pie. It was called a raspberry cream pie with a,
sounds good.
with a butter pie crust and then a layer of cream cheese and other things. And then a raspberry kind of almost puree, almost like a gelée, like a puree with, whipped cream on top of it. And so she entered it and she was the hit. And so she won. Not only did she win, but then they asked her to make it. That summer, in the 2 weeks, we made 256 raspberry cream pies at the state fair.
That's crazy. I think I can see what's coming when this podcast goes out. We're going to be asked for the recipe. Oh, that was just brilliant. I mean, thank you so much for spending the time, and I'm sure people are going to find that a fabulous podcast. And wish you a lovely rest of your day, Penny. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Bram Pie and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brampie.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.